Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Buonasera. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò. On behalf of the Centro Primo Levi and its director, Natalia Endrimi, I welcome you to this event. We both Casa and the Centro felt very strongly about the presentation of Susan Zuccotti's book here. Dr. Zucotti has been very generously and very often a participant in our events as a discussant, as a very thought-provoking respondent to papers of other people, and it's a great pleasure to welcome her to present her latest work. Dr. Zucotti is one of the most prominent scholars of the Holocaust, both in Italy and France, and her book on the relationship between the Church and the Holocaust, the book under his very windows, The Vatican and the Holocaust in Italy, published in 2000, is definitely an authority on the subject. She has received all sorts of recognitions and honors for her work as a scholar of the Holocaust. And her latest effort is this book dedicated to Père Marie-Benoît and Jewish rescue, published recently by Indiana University Press. And we are delighted that she accepted to come to the Casa to talk about it. So the structure of the evening is going to be that Dr. Zucotti is going to give a brief presentation using also some slides that she prepared for us. And then we're going to engage her in a conversation. Actually, we're going to continue because we were having a very, very interesting and passionate discussion upstairs. So please welcome Dr. Susan Zucotti. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. I'm pleased with the interest that you have shown in the book. I hope you will read it and like it, and I will tell you a bit about it tonight. Looking forward also to your questions. So I am going to begin by telling you a little bit about this priest. His name was Père Marie-Benoît. In Italian, you may know of him already as Padre Maria Benedetto. I have written about him in my other books in terms of his rescue efforts, both in France and in Italy, and I thought that it would be an interesting project to learn more about him as a human being, in addition to his rescue work. So I thought this would be easy. I thought writing a biography would be easy because I thought I knew a lot about him. I had written about what he did in Marseille to help Jews and rescue Jews, and I had written about the same in Italy, in Rome. I had done a lot of the research about the war years, so I thought, all right, a biography, it won't be too difficult. Well, I found it to be quite a different kind of historical challenge, which probably, the reasons will probably come out in the course of our discussion. But one was my concern that I would be able to find information about him. That was not so difficult as it turned out for several reasons. I went to several different places where I was able to get the information. Père Marie-Benoît was born, his secular name, it was Pierre Pétoul, and he was born in a small town called Le Bourg-d'Iré, not too far from Angers. So I have, I put a map on my program so that you can see that Angers is on the Loire River to the southwest of Paris. It is the most, has historically, since the French Revolution and probably before, been the most conservative area in France, and also an extremely highly traditional Catholic area. I write in my book about the persecution of Catholics during the French Revolution, which was very much part of his family heritage and affected his ancestors. I also write about the conflict between church and state at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, which also affected him very much as he grew up. He was born in 1895 and grew up just as the French state was trying to limit the influence of monasteries and Catholic orders, such as the Capuchins, the Franciscans, the Jesuits, preventing that kind of clergy, the regular clergy, as they're called, monks and nuns, from teaching and from educating priests in their particular orders. This kind of separation, conflict between the church and state very much influenced him as a young man. He was born in this house in 1895. His father was a miller. And this house is both a home and a mill on a river where water power was used to grind the wheat to make flour in the town. He had 3 brothers. This is a picture of him with his, taken later after he had been ordained. He is here with his father and 2 of his 3 brothers. In a very touching insert, the picture of his 3rd brother, there were 4 boys in the family in all, was inserted because he was not here at the time this picture was taken. And of course, the touching part is that the reason he was not there was because he was killed in the First World War. So the young man in the insert was also a seminary student training to be a priest when he joined the French army and was killed on the Marne in 1916. Père Marie-Benoît is a priest here, and as you can see, but he was not a priest during the First World War. His mother died when he was very young. And we can speculate as to the impact that may have had upon him as the oldest son in terms of his religiosity, his devotion to the faith, and also his broad humanitarian attitudes throughout his life. He was, as I said, a soldier in the First World War. Quite remarkable because he went from his... He left France to go to Belgium to study to become a Capuchin priest because he was unable to do this under the French laws of separation of church and state. So he had to leave the country to study to become a priest in the Capuchin order. So he moved to Belgium when he was in 1907, I think it was. So he was only about 11 or 12 years old when he made the move, and he never lived at home again. He studied he went to a second Capuchin Catholic secondary school in Belgium, and he then entered a seminary to begin his studies to become a priest. When the war broke out, he returned to France, joined up, and he actually fought in the trenches for the entire duration of the war. He was wounded, which probably saved his life, because he did spend 8 or 9 months in a hospital, which kept him out of the trenches. But except for that time, he was very much in the front lines, and he survived under these incredible difficulties. I think this period was probably quite decisive also in his life in terms of giving him a broader outlook on life than he otherwise would have had given his background and education. But there's no way to know that for sure. He never wrote that or said that. I often think that perhaps he met Jews in the trenches, that he may have known Jewish soldiers and officers, because he would not otherwise have known Jews growing up. And where did this great interest that he showed all his life in the Jewish people come from? But there's no way to know. I have seen his letters, I have examined his letters, his wartime letters to his mentors at his seminary. He never mentions it. But somehow this wartime experience must have broadened his outlook. This is a photograph of Pope Pius XI. The young man, Pierre Pétoul, about to become Père Marie-Benoît, went to Rome as a seminary student in 1921. He arrived fresh and eager and so excited to be there, and it is reflected in his writings and his diary notes. He didn't write a consistent long diary, I wish he had, but he did keep a list of what he did each day. Very, very short and terse. But on the day that Pope Pius XI was named to be Pope in 1922, a year after this young seminary student had arrived in Rome, Père Marie-Benoît wrote in his diary, "We have a Pope. I went to the Vatican and I saw that we have a Pope." So he was young, naive, enthusiastic, fresh, and very dedicated. He spent the years between the two wars in Rome as a teacher at the Capuchin seminary in Rome. This was the most prestigious of the Capuchin schools. If you were a good student in the provinces, you were sent to Rome to finish your education. He did that. He got a PhD in theology from the very prestigious Gregorian University in Rome. He was ordained in 1923, and then he spent the interwar period, basically teaching, as I said, at the Capuchin seminary. We know that he had some interest in Jewish issues because he joined an organization called Amici Israele in 1926, which was dedicated to improving Jewish-Christian relations. We will return to that, I hope, in our discussion. But otherwise, he was a teacher. In 1939, Pope Pius XI died, and Pope Pius XII became Pope. We see none of the same enthusiasm in his notes for Pius XII that he showed for Pius XI at the time of their election as popes. This, I don't mean to imply, meant that he was lukewarm about Pius XII, but I think it says quite a lot about his growth as an individual. He was much more sophisticated by 1939. He had not quite the same eager enthusiasm as a young man from the provinces in the great capital of the Catholic world. In any case, Pope Pius XII was the wartime pope. He became pope in February of 1939, and of course was pope until his death in 1958. The war broke out. And I have here a brief map to show you the division of France after the armistice between the French and the Germans in May and June. Actually, it was in June of 1940. Père Marie-Benoît was in Rome at the time of the war and had to leave Rome because he was a French national. He was a priest, but was a French national, so he left Rome with other French priests, took a train to the Free Zone, and established himself in Marseille. He was in Marseille until July of 1943, and that is where his rescue work began. This is a picture of Père Marie-Benoît with the first man with whom he cooperated in Jewish rescue. I am speeding through the story and probably already taking too much time, but Père Marie-Benoît, when he went to Marseille, became aware of the difficulties that Jews were having even in the unoccupied zone, the free zone. So I'll go back again. Jews from the German-occupied zone after the division of France at the time of the armistice often fled to the free zone if they could, and particularly foreign Jews in the occupied zone fled to the free zone, which was under Vichy control, but not directly, at least, under German control. Those Jews in the free zone who were foreigners, and at least one of them is here this evening, and I am proud to know her, moved to the free zone and found themselves in great difficulties. Often they were interned or in any case allowed to live under supervised residences. Often they had no papers, no documents, and no residence permits, sometimes not even passports or identification cards. Père Marie-Benoît was able to help people in those, with those problems and issues for several reasons. For one, people came to knock on his door. I always say, if you were a foreign Jew in the free zone or later in occupied Italy, a person you might ask for help, if you had no other contacts, would be a priest, because you, at the very least, would not expect to have him turn you in. He might not help you, he might refer you somewhere else, but he would most probably not turn you in. So people came to his monastery and asked for help, and then the word got out, and more came. And eventually, Père Marie-Benoît, after helping to provide documents, some of which were fabricated in the basement of the monastery where he was posted in Marseille, but after helping on an individual basis in that way, became involved with this man whose picture I showed you before, Joseph Bass. Joseph Bass was a Russian Jewish immigrant, brilliant man, who had taught himself French, gotten 2 degrees at the Sorbonne before the war, moved to the free zone, and begun to work. Actually, he had begun even before to help immigrants, but when immigrants were truly in danger, he became very involved with Jewish rescue. Joseph Bass's story has really not been told. People who know the subject and know about the righteous among the nations and know a few Jewish rescuers of Jews who were themselves Jewish, very often do not know Joseph Bass. But Joseph Bass was a great man who established a rescue network throughout the free zone. And Père Marie-Benoît learned the ropes with Joseph Bass. He learned what documents were necessary. He learned how to escort Jews from one safe house to another. He knew where to go to find funds to distribute to Jews in hiding. Joseph Bass knew it all, but and the rescue network was his organization. But Père Marie-Benoît learned from him and took those skills with him when he went to Rome, and suddenly faced a Jewish community with similar problems. This is Père Marie-Benoît with one of the rescuers, Madame Le Boucher, Fernande Le Boucher. She was, that is a pin on her jacket. It's not the Star of David. She was not Jewish. I tell her story in the book. She was married to a Jewish man. It's a poignant, difficult, very sad story, but also a story of her great heroism. She worked with Père Marie-Benoît to help rescue Jews, to take them to safe houses, and to keep in touch with them after they were hidden throughout the free zone. This is Angelo Donati, a story whose story I cannot go into in much detail during these few moments that I have, but Angelo Donati was an Italian Jew from Modena who had made a tremendous success of his life in banking and business in France. He was bilingual. Although Italian, remained in France for his entire adult life, but moved to Nice in the free zone when the Germans came to occupy the north of France. Angelo Donati did more than I can possibly tell you now to help Jews who were foreign Jews who were in the part of the free zone which was eventually occupied by the Italians. He was a great friend of Père Marie-Benoît, and I write a great deal about the work that they did together. We are back now to Pius XII, because this is my slide to point out to you that in July of 1943, Père Marie-Benoît was called back to Rome. Remember, I told you that he was sent to Marseille to get him out of France during the first years of the war, but for whatever reason, his Capuchin superiors called him back to Rome in July of 1943. At that time, Père Marie-Benoît, from now on, I will try to remember to call him Padre Maria Benedetto. That was his name in Italy while he was there. And Padre Maria Benedetto met with Pope Pius XII, bringing a plea both for French Jews, for some kind of expression of sympathy from the Pope, and for help with Donati's plan to try to get foreign Jews, and perhaps ideally all Jews, out of the free zone in France, which was no longer a free zone. It was by this time occupied by the Germans and the Italians. I'm sorry, the chronology is more than I can convey to you in my brief time. So in any case, Padre Benedetto did meet with Pius XII on this occasion. This is a picture of the hotel in Rome where many of the foreign Jews now coming, instead of going now, the foreign Jews from the occupied zone of France to the unoccupied zone of France, they are now going from German-occupied all of France into Italy. But the problem is the same. We're still talking about foreign Jews who need help because they have no papers, no documents, no money, no language skills, no friends, no contacts, totally dependent on outside help. Many of them were lodged in this Hotel Salus by Padre Benedetto and the rescuers who formed the network that he now set up with skills that he had learned from Joseph Bess. This is a photograph of Stefan Schwab, one of my favorite characters, a tremendously intriguing, charming man. I know his son very well. Son lives in Frankfurt and was very helpful to me. These two were incredibly close friends throughout their lives once they met in September 1943 in Rome. This picture obviously is taken much later because you can see all the wartime medals that Padre Benedetto received. But these two men worked together to rescue some 2,000 foreign Jews in Rome. This is a post-war picture. After the rescue, after the war, Padre Benedetto lived in Rome until 1953. At this point, he was transferred by his order to the south, where he taught in a seminary until 1956. And at that point, he was transferred back to France, where he spent the rest of his life. I will just say briefly, because I know we will go into it in our discussion, that Padre Benedetto, now again in France, and Père Marie-Benoît again, using that name again, and you see him here in the picture with the Baron Alain de Rothschild and Chief Rabbi Jacob Kaplan in France during a demonstration which was on the behalf of Soviet Jewry. This picture was taken in 1976. This photograph I have included because it's the demonstrable evidence of the fact that Padre Benedetto, Padre Marie-Benoît, dedicated the rest of his life after the Second World War to improving Jewish-Catholic relations. He never left the cause. He never left his friends. He was unique both because his wartime rescue involved working extremely closely with Jewish young men who became his close friends for life. So it was not his rescue network, it was a Jewish Christian rescue network. And he remains unique perhaps among the righteous, among the nations, because although there were a few others like him, but not too many, who dedicated the rest of his life to Jewish-Catholic reconciliation. So those are my remarks. That's the end of my slides. And I hope you will have many questions. I apologize for going through the political chronology so quickly, because that is quite confusing. But I hope it was clear, and I hope you have questions. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you. The presentation was very clear. The chronology was very complicated. The geography was even more complicated. But you made it very clear, both in your presentation and in your book. So it was, for me, also a great way to review my history of World War II in a very clear and specific way. What a formidable man he was. Incredibly complex and adventurous. Tell us something personal about the first time you came in contact with him, the first time you heard about it. You said you talk about him in your previous books. So when did you first heard of Père Marie-Benoît? And maybe you want to tell us something about your meeting. You met him once, yes, in person. And why don't you start with that, with the first time you heard about him in your studies, in your research, and then the time when you had a chance to meet him in person. What was your impression and what you talked about?
Well, I don't need that, do I?
You do. Yes.
Yes. All right. I don't like these things. I first came across Padre Maria Benedetto when I did the research for my first book about the Italians and the Holocaust, and that was a very long time ago, I assure you. You cannot write about the Holocaust in Italy without coming across Padre Maria Benedetto. He was truly exceptional in Rome. He moved a bit around Italy also during the war, as I discussed, but it was primarily Rome. And so I met him, figuratively speaking, during my research for that first book. My second book was about the Holocaust, the French and the Jews, in which I asked the same questions. I was always interested in, this is really in the 1980s, when the question was not being asked quite so much as it is today about popular responses to the Holocaust. People were studying government measures and policies and camps and deportation and trying to understand or grasp this enormous tragedy that had happened, but they were not asking so much about what the man and woman on the street did, whether they were Jewish or not. And I was interested in both Jews and non-Jews and how they understood what was happening and how they responded. So because my first book about Italy increased my fascination and interest with the subject, I wrote a similar book about France. And there he was again. So he was, again, outstanding in Marseille. And then he was in my other books as well, my book about the Vatican, and to a lesser degree, my book about Saint-Martin-Vésubie. But I did arrange to see him. He died in 1990, and I have the date in my book that I went to see him. I think it might have been 1988 or 89. Did I say? Did I? I don't remember. It was it was wonderful to go. I wrote to him. He wrote back immediately. Said absolutely he would be happy to see me. He had retired by that time, but was living in the monastery in Paris, where he had worked all of the last decade or two of his life. It is a very simple monastery. It's just a building, really, with a library and an archives and residence and dining hall. I didn't see all of that, of course, but I met him in the room for external guests, and he talked to me and was extremely welcoming. There were a couple of problems. The worst problem was that by this time he was very hard of hearing. And I was shouting questions in French. Well, you know, it's hard enough to do an interview in French, which I can do, but to shout the questions, you know, means you really have to pare down your language, and that was not so easy. So the interview was not as fruitful as I would have wished, but I did have a very good sense of the man, of his extreme generosity and kindness and interest in the younger generation and the questions that were coming up and being asked by people like me. As I was going out the door, another man was coming in to see him. This was '88. I was not so well versed in the history as perhaps I should have been, and certainly not as I am now. So I didn't realize that the man who was coming in to see him was Stefan Schwab, whose picture I showed you. And he was fantastic, but I didn't get it. And Stefan Schwab was only there for a day, so I couldn't say, well, will you come and talk to me tomorrow? You don't really say this to a man you're just passing by in the corridor. In any case, he was gallant and charming and everything that I learned him to be later on. As I did further research. And I must say that this friendship between those two men is so understandable to me because they had very similar personalities. Padre Maria Benedetto never challenged his superiors. He never did, well, he did challenge his superiors. He tried to avoid direct confrontation with his superiors. He was very diplomatic, but he was truly a maverick. He had his own way of thinking. He had a great imagination. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and so did Stefan Schwab. Very bright men who enjoyed, to some extent, the adventure of their lives. And I think it drew them together as friends. I won't take so long on the next answer.
As long as you want. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really a true pleasure to present Susan Zuccotti's new book, which she very modestly addressed as a biography of Père Marie-Benoît. In reality, for those of you who haven't read it, this book is really much more than a biography. It's an insightful study of Christian-Jewish relationships over a long and very special period of time. It's a very exemplary tale of how rescue operations occurred, by whom and how. And I think that because of this, she uses this extraordinary man and the story of this man to tell many, many stories that all of us think we know about, but the more you read, the more you realize how many missing pieces to the puzzles are there. So this is not really a question, but I'd like to encourage you to address a little bit these two very broad questions. One is his role in Jewish Christian relationships from the very beginning, and the other one is the rescue operation. We could get into that later. I mean, in terms of Christian-Jewish relations, I think it's very interesting to think of this young man arriving in Rome in 1921 and what he found.
Well, thank you for your kind words. That's why I tried to allude to it briefly. It is very touching to read about this young man coming into Rome in 1921, young man from the provinces, young man from the war, and his enthusiasm and excitement. We don't know very much about what he did during those years, except in the formal sense of being ordained and getting his doctorate in theology. But we do know that he joined an organization called Amici Israel in 1926. Why did he do this? He never said. But the organization was a primarily Catholic organization and primarily clergy, to which dozens of bishops and cardinals belonged and over 3,000 priests. This organization was dedicated and formed for the purpose of improving Catholic-Jewish relations. It's a long story in itself. There are undercurrents and different kinds of objectives for this organization. It seems to have been a concern of the members also that conversion to Catholicism should be improved and enhanced by means of an improvement of Jewish-Christian relations. In other words, these priests were smart enough to say, we're never going to get converts if we're so nasty. We're not going to have people join the church if anti-Semitism remains so strong, and we would like to improve Christian-Jewish relations. For that reason, and for other reasons. And this is an extremely complex and very subtle balance, which I would also say, and we were discussing this before the lecture as well, the presentation as well, that this balance changed with time during the late 20s and into the 30s, and certainly after the war, so that the conversion aspect of it dropped, and the concern for reconciliation, understanding, and intellectual growth based on understanding and relationship between the two groups became much stronger. I also would not say or mean to imply that all those in Amici Israel were dedicated to or concerned about conversion. I think the motives of the members was different for different members. However, this was something that Père Marie-Benoît did, which is the only indication we have of any interest that he may have had in the Jewish people before the war. Suddenly, we see him in Marseille in 1940 with Jewish refugees knocking on his door, and he is becoming deeply involved. That interest in liking for the that interest in Jewish rescue translated into a great commitment for Jewish Christian or Jewish Catholic friendship after the war. And it started immediately upon the liberation of Rome in June of 1944. Padre Benedetto's first acts after the war were still on behalf of the Jewish people, and he basically did that for the rest of his life. In the first days after the war, he helped distribute funds from Jewish and Catholic organizations to those who were destitute. He tried to, his monastery became a center for the distribution of matzo during the high holidays of 1944. And more intellectually, which was his general bent in any case, he began a lecture series and an organization he called Amicizia Ebraica Cristiana, in which he tried to bring Jewish and Catholic audiences together to study the Old Testament and to delve into the theological trends and theological convictions that the two peoples shared. This was revolutionary and very much not approved by the high authorities in the Vatican. Jewish-Christian relations, friendships were deeply frowned upon by the Vatican during these years. So for him, it was a radical step, and one that he never, ever hesitated to make. So I'm not sure if that's covered all the points, but...
Yes, Susan, following up to Alessandro's question, and yes, definitely your book is way more than a biography, and especially it's interesting for these investigation on these case in point of Jewish-Catholic relationships. And it's, as you prove in your book, complicated, complex, on some level ambiguous. And, but you brought to light some realities like the Amici Israel, for example, that is almost unknown. It lasted only for 2 years because then it was abolished by the Vatican. But it had this incredible popularity among the clergy and among the high clergy as well. And the other example you give is that order of nuns, Notre Dame de Sion, also established with the final goal of praying for the conversion of Jews and turning during the years of the war into just friends of the Jews and helping in the rescue, Père Marie-Benoît and many others. What is the idea that you had of these ambiguous relationship of people that felt these close relationship to the Jews, at the same time with this background of the possibility of conversion hanging in the air, it never manifested? What is your conclusion after you studied many of these priests and nuns that had definitely an interest for the Jewish people, definitely an interest for Jewish culture, for the Jewish religion? One other thing that you mentioned in your book is that among the subjects that Père Marie-Benoît studied and taught was Hebrew, biblical Hebrew and Old Testament. And then you said that some of his Jewish friends said he was not really fluent in Hebrew, but he could read it and he could make his way along. So there was a cultural and theological interest in Judaism, an affinity, a friendship, a closeness, and at the same time, being Catholics at this time, there is always this idea of a possible conversion hanging out. In your study of Père Marie-Benoît, does the issue of conversion ever come out, or was he always uninterested in that and more interested in the cultural closeness of the two religions and the personal friendship with his Jewish friends?
Well, as you speak, you're making me think of so many things to say that I can't possibly remember them all. He studied Hebrew at the Gregorian University. It was part of his doctorate program for theology. And he did quite well. We have his report card, if you will, and he did pretty well in all his subjects. But someone did suggest, actually Fernand Le Boucher, whose picture I showed you, did suggest that perhaps that was the origin of his interest in the Jewish people, that perhaps he enjoyed Hebrew, or perhaps he went to the old ghetto. I don't think that's in my, because there's no proof at all, but that he might have gone to the former ghetto in Rome and met some Roman Jews and had them help him with Hebrew. That was alleged by Fernand Le Boucher, but the origin, whether the truth of that, I have no idea, and no way, obviously, no way to know. About the relationship between conversion and Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish-Christian friendship. And did this ever come up in my book? Yes, came up many times. For one thing, Father Père Marie-Benoît was called upon to comment about conversions, and he sometimes used this in reports to his superiors, in which he said, there have been conversions made. And that in itself is a very long and difficult question. Did the pressure come from the priests? Did the pressure come from the refugees themselves, who thought that but through conversion they could save themselves? And what was the moral obligation of priests who came into this kind of situation? I would just say that Padre Marie-Benoît used this reference to "we've had conversions" to his superiors, I think, to convince them to allow him to continue the work he was doing. He made it very clear that he did not wish to make conversions, but he made it very clear to the Jewish people, not to his own superiors. One woman I know very well who lives in Israel today had a terribly difficult time as a young girl going through France and then Italy. And she, in fact, met Père Marie-Benoît. She left him on a mission that he sent her on to distribute funds to Jews in the north. She was then in Florence during the bombing of Florence. She lost her father, and she converted to Catholicism. After the war, she went to see him. First of all, she reported that when he left her on and sent her on the mission, he blessed her and said, "Above all, remain a good Jewess." And then when she came back to him after the war, he said, "You should not have converted. You should have spoken to me first, and I would have talked to you about it more seriously, and we would have gone through your motives and your convictions and your thoughts." She later returned to Judaism, but is herself a living example, a shining example of a great love for both her Jewish people and for the Catholics who she knew. So this is a very difficult question, which he did treat in his book. I wrote and brought my own copy of the book in order to read to you what he wrote about conversion, but I think probably I should just talk. It's on page, the best is on page 204. He writes about conversion and how conversion will happen when God is ready, and that if it has not happened, it is because it is not God's will, and that it is perhaps best for Jews and Christians to live side by side with their own convictions and finding their own way to God. Now, this was revolutionary for a Catholic priest to ever say, and he wrote that quite publicly. Just one more thing about conversion, and that is that you undoubtedly know that if you were a priest or a good Catholic in the 20s and 30s and early 40s, you believed, and Padre Marie-Benoît did not believe it, but generally speaking, you believed that the way to salvation was through the Catholic Church. And therefore, if you loved someone, or if you loved a group, or if you had friends, or if you loved a people, the way to show your love was to ensure their salvation. And that was done through conversion. This is a very difficult concept to get away from if you are a believer. And as I said, Padre Marie-Benoît obviously didn't believe it because of what he wrote about finding one's own way to God side by side. But it was I think the nuns of the Notre Dame de Zion, the priests in Amici Israel, were motivated very much by their liking for the Jewish people, difficult as it may sound.
Well, from the very beginning of a book, you realize that we're dealing here with a man of extraordinary qualities, curiosity, and talents. I mean, this is a man that she describes in World War I, in the trenches, composing Gregorian chants and saving people in his role as a medic. So he was strong-willed and somewhat of an independent thinker. And so again, just to try to wrap up this very big issue of conversion, when he gets to Rome, the climate is one of encouraging conversion from the church part, for sure. And he speaks out very clearly about his feelings towards the Jewish people as early as that, by both criticizing anti-Semitism and traditional Catholic anti-Judaism. So the question is really, this person had his ideas about Judaism, about who the Jews were, and what the friendship and solidarity, cooperation could be between Christians and Jews. Could you just try to trace a little bit what happened, his context with the Jews, and what happened really in his thinking about this subject before we get tragically to the war, and when he is projected in an emergency situation and he really lives up to it?
Truthfully, I don't think I can. I mean, we do not know whether he knew, had any Jewish contacts or friendships before those first refugees knocked on his door in Marseille in 1940. He had studied Hebrew, so perhaps, as I said, he had met Jews in Rome, but that would have not been encouraged by his teachers at the Gregorian University to go into the former ghetto and meet Jewish people. A young seminary student, easily influenced, that would not have been approved, and I don't know that it happened. I speculate that he might have known and become very fond of Jews and other anti-clericals in the French army during the First World War. He had never had a chance to meet either one. But other than that, we don't know. And so this these first steps that he took in Marseille, in a sense, come out of the blue, except for the fact that he was already, as you said, in the First World War, a man who, with great concern for other human beings and very courageous to begin with.
Why don't we open the discussion to the audience? If you have questions, I assume that some of you might have read the book, some of you might have not read the book, so that's an interesting piece of information for Dr. Zucotti before she answers your question. Please.
Yes, since his activities were frowned upon by his superiors, how come he wasn't censored?
The question is, how come he wasn't censored by his superiors, since his opinions seem to have been frowned upon?
Sent to another faraway country, not Rome.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds as if you may have read my book, because he was.
No, I didn't. I'd like to.
He was, I'm trying to think, during the war and in the immediate post-war, very immediate post-war years, he was called upon by his superiors to justify what he was doing. And we know that because we have some letters that he wrote telling what he was doing. So there were questions being asked, but he wasn't being censored yet. I should backtrack and say that during the war itself, we also, that your question touches upon the degree to which Vatican officials may have approved of priests who were involved in Jewish rescue. In other words, so let me start with that. So there is the question of whether there was Vatican supervision or direction or encouragement of efforts to help Jews in Rome itself. That's what Padre Maria Benedetto was doing. Was this contrary to the wishes of Pius XII? Or was it because of Pius XII? I have studied this question at great length and come out with the belief, that the conviction that Pius XII was aware of priests and nuns and monks who were helping Jews, that he did not stop it, but he also did not support it, and he did not encourage it, but he didn't discourage it. In other words, the philosophy was save victims of the war, help those in need, help those who are suffering. And Padre Benedetto was not yet violating any tenets of any theological tenets at that point. After the war, when he began to maintain his Jewish friendships, that became problematic, and that's when he was called upon to explain himself. We don't see those original letters, questions. We only see his responses because he kept copies in his archives. And they're not saying you shouldn't do this, but they are, his superiors are saying, what are you doing? Joint studies together with Jews of the Old Testament, That's not side by side in classrooms, Jews and Christians. That was very much disapproved of. And in fact, that lecture series was forced to stop after just a few months. So that's a form of censure. He was not allowed to continue with that effort. He did continue with his friendships and his contacts and his help, but in 1953 he was, in fact, sent away. So he was sent to a small seminary, a very provincial seminary in the south of Italy, Campobasso, on the excuse that they needed priests, that there was a shortage of priests and teachers. The reason was never given, but it was clearly a demotion. And then after 3 years in Campobasso, he was sent to a seminary near Tours in France, but out of Rome. So clearly his career did not flourish. He did not become a director of a Catholic institution or a prestigious seminary, but he continued to do the work that he was so dedicated to.
I think one of the things that could interest the audience and could spur a lot of questions is really Père Marie-Benoît's role in rescue of Jews and how he collaborated with Jewish organizations. I think that one of the great merits of the book is to show this case as really paradigm of the two different moments of what happened chronologically, first in France and in Italy, but also in all other, to a smaller degree, countries that were occupied by the Nazis. So weeks after the beginning of the war, there was a storm of refugees from initially Belgium, Netherlands, and many other countries arriving in France. And I think that the book really illustrates the way in which initially this refugee emergency was met by the work of Jewish rescue committees. These were local Jews in France or in Italy who knew what the problems were, had access to international funds, contacts with the Joint Distribution Committee and other such funds. And they did the bulk of the work because they knew, they understood the needs and the dangers, and they had roots in the country. As the Nazis moved in, first France and then Italy, many of these people and these organizations had to go underground and couldn't have the same range of motion and possibility. And so they appealed to lay people and selective members of the church, of which Père Marie-Benoît is an example, fantastic example in Rome. And so, in reality, what's really one of the strong parts of the book is to see how this particular Capuchin priest worked in Italy with Delazem, and particularly during the 9-month Nazi occupation of Rome, what he was able to do together with his pre-existent occupation. You've seen in the slide, for instance, that one hotel where a lot of the refugees were put. In reality, what they did was to find places, first in hotels and pensioni, then later in convents and families, provide funds, distribute food, clothes, false papers, all of this. So I think that what's so dramatic is to imagine how a man of a church could move around Rome during those 9 months, and perhaps you could tell a little bit about the terror of those years and what his daily activity might have looked like.
Well, there's no question, I'm glad that you brought it up, there's no question that this rescue effort was a joint Jewish-Catholic effort. And the two groups, Joseph Bass with Père Marie-Benoît, Stefan Schwab with Padre Marie-Benedetto, they were teams, and each brought their own skills and abilities to the team. And together, they were able to do much more than either one of them, or Jews and Christians separately, could have done. That's point number one. Well, that's because Jews had to hide. Jewish men could not move around the streets as easily as non-Jews could. On the other hand, Jews could bring clients, proteges, refugees, could make recommendations, could bring people in need to the Catholic rescuers. And the Catholic rescuers could find hiding places in the mountains, could find hiding places in monasteries and convents that the Jews could not have found. So together, the teams were very effective. I think the Jewish dimension of these rescue teams has not been stressed sufficiently. Thanks to Yad Vashem, there's been, and other popular approaches, including my own, I suppose. There's been a lot of attention given to the righteous, I in my book. But I've tried to make this book, and I had a very hard time with the title because I wanted to make it both a biography of him and his growth as a priest, but also always emphasize that he was working with Jews and that this was not the common kind of rescue operation. So the Jewish dimension has not been studied. I meet people all the time who have never heard of Joseph Bass, probably not Stefan Schwab either. Maybe this will help to remedy that. But so that's now about what he did on a day-to-day basis in Rome. Padre Benedetto was learning from Joseph Bass, but in Rome, he was the one who knew how to operate. He knew how to get the false papers, and he knew where the monasteries and convents were that might take Jews. So he worked with Stefan Schwab, who was very smart and very clever, and others other Jewish men who I mentioned in my book. But a typical day would have been a fugitive would have knocked on the door of his convent, asked for help. Generally, they did not stay in his convent. They were escorted to the Hotel Salus or some other pension where they could be provided with false papers. And then as soon as possible, they were taken out of the hotels and pensions and lodged in apartments. And Padre Benedetto directed that effort. He didn't necessarily do it, but he had himself, but he had couriers, a lot of times women. And the women, the Jews who were the couriers on the street, escorting people to hiding places, tended very often to be women, because they could serve Italian Jewish women who could get through an interrogation, because men, when captured, would be detected immediately as Jews, but the women not so much. So the Jewish women escorted them around, and also helped on a daily basis to deliver papers and the money came from the Jewish organization De La Sem. So it was an intricate and effective organization, if you will, but also one which entailed a great deal of danger and moments of terror.
Yes. The clergy in France did not help the Jews, but the clergy in Italy were absolutely fantastic. Fantastic, it was unbelievable. I was in a convent. Nobody tried to convert us. The church did not allow to convert the people that they under their guidance. We were never converted to nothing. And I was in a convent in Florence.
And where did you come from? You went to Florence from where? From where did you come?
That's a long story. We were in a little village in France. And in 1943, the 9th of September, the Italians made peace with the Allies. And we were on the group in France in a little village, Saint-Martin-Vésubie. And the Italian,
I know Via very well. She's
and
my
the
good friend.
Italian soldier told us, if you stay in this village, the Germans are down from the French Riviera, Nice, and they will pick you up. You better go with us. And we followed the Italian army through the mountain, very high mountain. What was the mountain?
The
Alps. Very high, and we ended up in a little village in Italy. And in this little village, there were 500 people, and we were maybe 600 Jewish people coming through the mountain from France. At this point, the German knew about us because they asked for more food, this village. And they came and picked us all up. I was also picked up, and I was 14 years old. For some reason, I got up and I told the German soldier there, who must have been maybe 4 years older than I, and I said to him in German, I speak 5 languages, and I told him in German, when the Russians are going to come to Germany, they will do the same what you are doing to us Jews. He didn't kill me, he let me sit, and time went by, and it started raining, and thundering, and a van came to pick us up to the concentration camp. So I went up, you know, when you're young, you're stupid, and I said, could I go and take a blanket? It's so cold. He said, go. Of course, I didn't go to the blanket, I went back to the mountains. And from the mountains, we were helped by the Catholic Church. We were about 300-400 people. And the church helped us. It was October, end of October, and they said it's too cold here. The British are down in Sardinia, which is the boot of Italy, and we were in the north. So they helped us go down to Florence, and we were helped by the Archbishop of Florence, who took in 800 people and divided us in different places till the liberation of Florence. And every week, I was hit by, after the convent, I was hit by a family, and the family, I went every week to the church, to the Archbishop, and the secretary, Monsignor Monoghello, he saw me, he used to say, Buongiorno Piccolina, and I was short, I didn't go much, and he gave me money. And I was under the impression that this Catholic church money, but then Mrs. Zuccotti explained to me that the money came from Jewish organization in America.
Well, thank you very much for your personal direct witness, Leah. Thank you for sharing with us. Other questions? Yes, the gentleman.
I must second your observation about the lack of credit that Jewish rescuers have received from Jews and non-Jews. Most of the credit went to the Gentiles. Without the Gentiles, who hid, who provided transportation and papers and so on, obviously there would have been no rescue. But I'm from Belgium. In Belgium there was an organization, an underground organization called the Committee for the Defense of the Jews, the Comité de Défense des Juifs. And it was initiated and driven by Jews, but the executive arm were, of course, non-Jews. About 4,000 children were placed in private homes, in convents, and so on, and they were escorted mainly by Gentile women. And the organization had many, many different layers. We don't have the time here to go, but there were people assigned to find places, people assigned to bring, to escort the children and the adults, people assigned to visit monthly and pay. Most of the people could not afford to feed additional mouth and so on. So I note that from what you explained here that in France there was somewhat the same kind of organization. In other words, it couldn't have happened with non-Jews only or with Jews only. So my question is, what weight would you assign to either one of the, to both? Was the non-Jewish contribution the determining one, or was it the Jewish contribution, or was it, or you cannot quantify it? In Belgium, it was very quantifiable.
I think that the answer would probably be it would depend on each city or each region or small area, because the personnel available were different in different places. I would not give or assign a general quantifiable description, but I think it's important for us to remember that the initiatives generally came from the Jewish community. Catholics were preoccupied with their own problems. You know, they had their poor people. They had people whose husbands were prisoners of war in Germany and needed funds. They had later on victims of bombing raids, and they were focused on their own congregations and their own suffering parishioners. What's very clear in Italy is the fact that when Jewish DLSM representatives, DLSM was the Jewish Refugee Assistance Organization that predated the war, when DLSM representatives went to a local prominent cardinal, Monsignor, and as in with the Mrs. Quitt's description, as happened in Florence, they asked for help and cooperation. Two things happened. One, it became quite apparent that those archbishops or bishops or cardinals or were not even aware of the Jewish problems. There had not, some, of course, some. If there'd been major roundups, yes, but they were not aware of the subtleties of foreign Jews without papers who really needed to hide. It was the Jews who brought that to their attention. And so the second thing that is revealing about this relationship is that usually what happened was the archbishop, who had lots of things to do, but who had gotten the first petition, assigned someone from his entourage to have that particular responsibility. And that was done in Mrs. Quitt's case by Monsignor Meneghello. Yes, exactly. And that pattern was repeated in Turin, not in Rome so much, because the existence of the Vatican changed things, but in Genoa, in Turin, in Milan to a certain extent, in smaller Italian cities. It was, so the initiative came from the Jews, but the rescue effort, I would say, was conducted by both groups.
This story, the story of DLSM and Benoit in Rome, and Benoit and the Jewish men in Paris and southern France before that, are such great, uplifting, hopeful kinds of stories. These are stories that you seldom hear, and the detail of a story makes you really understand what was going on from everybody's side. So the question is, why do you think that a story that is so emblematic of hope and of reconciliation took so long to have a book about? I mean, why have most people not heard of him, at least not in this detail, for 70, 80 years?
That's one I think I'd have to think about. There have been things written about him. There have been, one problem with what has been written about him in the past is it was very often quite garbled. there was not the understanding of the way the persecutions developed, so that chronologies are wrong, rescue efforts are badly described, and it's just not clear from there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. I think that's one reason. Although he was looked upon as a great hero by those who knew about him, including a number of clergymen, including priests in the United States, who wrote essays or chapters, maybe for America Magazine or maybe from Commonwealth. This priest, this French priest who's become named by Yad Vashem, he's brought honor to us. That kind of story was written in a short form, but usually with the facts all wrong.
Susan, I have one more question, and then we have one more there. One of the issues that comes up again and again, whenever you hear about these stories about righteous Gentiles or Jewish rescuers, is why did they do it? And in the specific case of Père Marie-Benoît, is why did he do it? And you tackle the issue at several points in your book in a very delicate manner. You don't want to speculate too much, and yet you want to offer some sort of answer to this crucial question. Why did somebody who could have had a very peaceful life within the quiet and secure borders of a monastery decides to put his life on the line to do something like this? And you have a few hypotheses that you advance, again, in a very delicate manner, very much in your style. And I wanted to ask you to share them with us.
One of the difficulties of writing a biography, I realize, is that I'm not supposed to speculate. I'm supposed to stick to the facts. And in this case, it's very difficult to find an answer. But it is a question that people want answered. So I tried in the book, but without being too certain. I think there were a number of things. I think that on the very superficial, to begin at the beginning, people knocked on his door. He was a good man. He did what he could starting out. That's how he started. He was a good man. He wasn't going to turn them away. At this point, they were not being deported. This was in late 1940 and early 1941 in Marseille. These were people in need, people in danger, people who might be interned. But the Nazi Gestapo soldier on the corner, the tremendous degree of terror had not yet begun. But they knocked on his door and he helped. And then he met more. And I think he was a man who truly, and this maybe sounds silly or too general or stereotypical, he came very much to like the Jewish people. He liked the people he met. He maintained contacts with them. He particularly liked Joseph Bass, and this is again at the beginning. Number one, he told me when I asked him the question, well, I was at the convent monastery in Marseille. I'd been sent there from Rome because the Italians had gone to war against my country. So I'd been sent to Marseille, and I was there with nothing to do, so I did it. He had no more of an answer than that. I think another answer on a much more superficial level was, for him, this was a great adventure. He was a man of action who was also a profound scholar. We haven't talked about his scholastic work, his academic work, or his philosophical writings, but so he was very much a contemplative and solitary man, but he was also a man of action, and you get the sense when you read his accounts of what he did that this was a great adventure, and Stefan Schwab felt the same way. So I think it's a combination of those things. We've talked a little bit tonight before about his past and growing up as a member of a persecuted group, the Catholic Church in anti-clerical France at the turn of the century, the onset of the 20th century, and that may also have made him more sensitive to the sufferings of minorities. And then, of course, I think the bottom line was that he was simply a very fine human being.
One last question, yes.
He was a good human being.
I have a question and an answer. The question is, was he ever close to being arrested?
Yes.
That would be, I'd love to hear about how he was saved.
Yes, he was extraordinarily close to being arrested on one occasion, and I think on many others he had some narrow escapes. I begin my book with the story of how he was almost arrested. It's a very dramatic story, and that's the way I lead my readers in, and then I discuss it later. But in February or March or April, maybe April, of 1944, he and Stefan Schwab went to Milan to pick up money that was coming from the Joint Distribution Committee in Florence, in Geneva, in Switzerland. So the funds were coming in, and the two of them were hoping to get more financing for their efforts in Rome. They were sitting together in a restaurant. Stefan Schwab made a phone call to the contact, a woman, and spoke to her and told her where they were. He didn't know that she was under arrest and the Germans were in her apartment. So she said to them, "Wait there, I'll meet you." And the Gestapo came to the restaurant, arrested Stefan Schwab, and did not know about Padre Maria Benedetto. I guess thought he was just a priest who was a friend. So he was not arrested, and the Gestapo came back for him later, but he was gone. And Stefan Schwab was deported to a secondary camp outside of Auschwitz, and he did survive.
And the answer is about the righteous. Let me say I'm the author of a book on the artists under the sheet, and I am also a survivor. But my answer to your question is about why that person was not celebrated, was that often the righteous, the true righteous, did not want attention. They thought that what they had done was normal, was not anything exceptional. They did not see themselves as exceptional. That's my...
Yeah, I would also just add to that was also true of the Jews who were rescuers. Angelo Donati did not attract a great deal of attention for what he had done, but the most vivid example is Joseph Bass, who absolutely did not want to talk about it. And Joseph Bass' son, who I have also met, I met Stefan Schwab's son and also Joseph Bass' son. Joseph Bass' son is really quite bitter that Joseph Bass has not been recognized as the great rescuer that he was, but he refused to talk about it after the war. He did not want the attention. Padre Maria Benedetto did write about what he had done, and that's been extremely useful to me. He did not duck the attention, in part because he was questioned so much about what he had done by leaders of the church. And even to the extent that when the some of the Vatican documents were published and made claims that the Vatican had helped him, Padre Benedetto, he felt that it was incumbent upon him to write that he received no help from the Vatican.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank again the Centro Primo Levi and its director Natalia Andrimi for helping us organizing this event, Alessandro Cassin, the deputy director, board members of the Centro Primo Levi, Alessandro Di Rocco and Stella Levi for being here with us tonight, and of course Dr. Susan Zucotti for having brought back to life this incredible story. And I think it's very important for you now to remember that the book we presented tonight is Père Marie-Benoît and Jewish Rescue. It's published by Indiana University Press. You find it in bookstores and you can order it online. And I strongly, strongly encourage you to buy it and read it. Thank you again all very much for being with us tonight. Thank you.